Good evening, Dr. Kaku, and good evening, Professor Laszlo. Thank you very much for agreeing to join me in this conversation.
Our pleasure.
I'd like to start, as I normally do these conversations, since we've been doing them for some time. If you had to choose one person that you could conjure up from history and have a conversation with, what would it be, who would it be, and what would it be about? Dr. Kaku?
I would probably choose Sir Isaac to have a conversation with, because if you take a look at the world before Newton, it was a world of magic, a world of superstition, a world where spirits and ghosts ruled the solar system, where there were no rules, there was no mathematics for the cosmos. And after Isaac Newton, all of a sudden we had a mathematics, we had the calculus, we had the laws of motion, and we had a framework of space and time. And so from darkness, we went to light and enlightenment with the calculus and with the universal law of gravitation. And his rules, of course, lasted 300 years. And even Einstein, when he made his tremendous contributions, Einstein did not create a new mathematics. He borrowed the old mathematics of advanced calculus. He did not invent new scientific marvels of space and time. He simply bent the space and time of Isaac Newton. So I think a mind like that would be fascinating to interact with.
And what would you be interacting about if you had the opportunity? What might you ask or talk to Professor Sir Isaac Newton about?
In hindsight, what Isaac Newton gave us a paradigm for unification. Heavenly physics and earth-like physics were supposed to be totally different. On earth, there was supposed to be sin, venial sin, and different kinds of sin, mortal sin. The heavens were supposed to be perfect, the music of the spheres. He unified the earth-like physics and the heavenly physics to give us a unified physics of the cosmos known at that time. Today, we physicists are now trying to unite Einstein's theory of curved Newtonian physics and the quantum theory, the theory of the atom, to unify them in a cosmic theory that will give us a theory of everything.
I see. So within the new context, do you suppose Isaac Newton would have come up with just as brilliant ideas as he did for the time?
It's hard to say. Of course, Isaac Newton, in the later years of his life, began to dabble in alchemy and stuff like that.
Yes, I read about it.
But then again, alchemy was the science 1600s. If you were a chemist in the 1600s, you would dabble in alchemy because that's all there was in terms of the laws of science. So I think today, if he were alive, he would be fascinated by the greatest unification of all. The unification of atomic physics, the quantum theory, with the Big Bang and the universe. That is the theory of everything.
And Professor Laszlo, yourself?
I wouldn't mind having conversations with Sir Isaac either, you see. But I think my choice would be Albert Einstein, the philosopher, and perhaps even more specifically, Alfred North Whitehead. Whitehead, you see, who took his cue from Einstein, he undertook a project which needs to be done today, because it needs to be done over and over again. And that's to take the latest theories of the sciences, the latest insights, and build a conceptual framework that will unite them, so that we can have not only a physics of everything, but a metaphysics. A metaphysics which includes the physical universe, which includes the living world, and includes the human being. So I think that's a project that needs to be done at all times, because if we have truly a theory of everything, it has to be a theory of human consciousness as well as life, biological organism, as well as the quantum, as well as of the cosmos.
And how would a physicist react to that?
Well, I think it's very difficult. Someone once asked once asked Einstein about taxes, and he said, "Oh, that's much too hard." It takes a philosopher to understand taxes, okay? So Einstein realized that in some sense the fundamental laws of the universe are fundamental. They are simple, elegant, pure. Well, the laws of humans are messy. We're talking about passions that are irrational. This doesn't mean that we can't eventually have a tapestry by which we can see unifying themes within human behavior. It just means it's very hard.
I see. So do you foresee perhaps eventually a science of humans that would be as precise as the physics of particles?
Maybe, maybe not. Isaac Asimov, in his Foundation series, wrote about a secret second foundation, Maybe a foundation similar to the foundation for the
yes,
future.
Yes, I've read about it.
But a second foundation that wrote the laws of meta-history so that you could predict the history of a galactic empire. Now, when we physicists today look at Asimov's theory of a second foundation, we try to be much more modest. And we try to say that the best we could do is look at civilizations on the basis of energy consumption. That's very easy to measure. We have three types of energy sources in the universe. We have planetary energy, we have stellar energy, and we have galactic energy, like in the second foundation. So therefore, in civilizations far beyond ours, we expect to have types of civilizations, type 1, type 2, and type 3. We are type 0. We are a civilization rent by nations and wars and fundamentalist passions. However, in the next 100 years or so, we expect to see the birth of a type 1 civilization, a truly planetary civilization that harnesses planetary energies, like that can control the weather, for example. And I'm proud to be alive in an era where you can see the birth of this type 1 civilization. It is a type 1 telephone system. The European Union is the beginning of a type 1 economy. English is going to be the type 1 language of the future. Nation states are withering away, giving birth to perhaps a type 1 planetary political system. And we're beginning to see the birth of a type 1 culture. Blue jeans, rock and roll, and rap music. My God. Who would have predicted that would be the culture of a type 1 civilization?
Professor Laszlo, how would you fit conception of the future over a 100-year time frame as an expert, as a theorist, as somebody who knows evolution inside out?
Well, I agree that we can have a highly encompassing kind of idea of all things that go on, because the key there is development, or as I prefer to call it, evolution. That is progressive, irreversible change. Statistical, not determinate as to everything that is happening, but on the whole irreversible, and moving in some preferred directions. Whether we look at the cosmos, whether we look at life on Earth, whether we look at civilization, it's moving in some determinable direction. And these are then general laws of evolution, which are statistical laws, and they give us a handle for understanding how the human arose out of the non-human biological matrix, how the biological matrix arose out of a physical matrix, how all of this arose out of the Big Bang, and how possibly the Big Bang arose out of a metaverse, which could have been a multi-cyclic universe as well. So I believe that the evolution in a systemic and holistic but rigorous perspective gives us a handle, not for telling everything precisely, not for foretelling, predicting, but for understanding the general thrust of things are going. Now, I myself find this idea of type 1, type 2, type 3 civilizations based on energy fascinating. I'm not using it as the basic concept, because it uses one parameter, basically the energy parameter, as the key concept. And I think when you deal with life and then you deal with humans, a number of complex parameters are coming into play as well. So what determines civilization, I think, are many things other in addition to
the consumption of energy and the level of consumption of energy. And what would your perspective on evolution be as a physicist, just in terms of, in the context of what he just described?
Well, I think evolution has to have a driving force, an engine behind it. Darwinian evolution, the driving force there is simply survival, okay? And species mutate in response to changes in the... Here on the planet Earth, we have the fact that the gross national product of nations grows at about 3% per year on average. And that's because people want a better life. They want a better distribution of wealth. They want middle class comforts. And so given the fact that we have an engine driving the economy at roughly 3% a year, if you would extend that, therefore, to hundreds, thousands of years into the future, you begin to realize that within 100 you would then attain planetary energies. Within a few thousand years, you would begin to attain stellar energies capable of manipulating stars. And then on a scale of hundreds of thousands to millions of years, growing at 3% a year, you would begin to have galactic energy, similar to the second foundation in Isaac Asimov's series. So I think that this evolution is not inevitable, because I think the most dangerous transition is between type 0 to type 1. By the time type 1 status, you have a planetary culture, a planetary ethic, a planetary spirit, a planetary way of looking at crises around the Earth like global warming. Type 0, you're talking about a fragmented civilization based on nation states, based on greed, plunder, the strong make the rules. And so the transition between type 0 to type 1 is, I think, the most stupendous. And we're seeing it all around us. Every day when I open the newspaper, I say, yet the foundation for a type 1 civilization is being laid. Mm-hmm. But it's also the most dangerous.
Yes.
Global warming. We have no planetary government that is capable of reining in global warming, for example. Pollution, nuclear proliferation. The United Nations is simply not powerful enough to stop India and Pakistan from going at it with nuclear weapons. And so I think that this is very dangerous. And I think we're seeing this happen. Not only do we see the internet forging a planetary culture, a planetary language, and a planetary economy, but we also see fragmentation in the world. Which trend will win? I don't know.
I see a tremendous similarity in terms of that line between 0 and 1 that he draws with the concept that you articulate as it relates to the 3 C's that need to transition to a new set of 3 C's, if I might relate that. You describe the current situation or the immediate past as the 3 C's of colonization and consumption, having to be transitioned into the 3 C's of connection, communication, and comprehension, which seems to me to have a very close parallel to the notion of a movement from a type 0 to a type 1, as Professor Kaku is describing. Would you care to comment on that?
I see a lot of similarities. I think basically how we package this, you see, how we put, what kind of framework we put on it, can differ. I think the outcome of the analysis is similar. I see a human civilization as unfolding directed by certain myth, basically. Ideas that people have. The biological evolution is directed by inborn, genetically determined behavior patterns and relations to the environment. As soon as you reach the level of the human, another kind of coding takes over, called cultural coding, right? Other than just genetic coding. That means ideas. And now no longer do we have the separation between genome and phenome. Now you have a total system that creates innovations and changes itself constantly by its innovations. Now the driving forces, Professor Kaku said, there is a driving force. I think the overall driving force is what you can call technology. But technology in a very broad sense, in which the control of fire was already technology, the invention of wheel was certainly the invention of writing is a major technological breakthrough. And since then, we are having a series of technological innovations that constantly rock and transform society. Now, the kind of technologies that we've been using in the Western world, starting in the Levant for the past 10,000 years, had a particular thrust. Elsewhere in civilizations, like in India or in the East or in the Southern Hemisphere, this was not the case. But starting in the Neolithic communities in the Levant and then into Europe and some parts of Asia, there has been a particular thrust. The thrust was to transform nature to serve basically human needs and human ends. That enabled tribes to settle, to create settled communities, enabled always an ever larger use of energy and ever more food production, enabled population to grow, and society had to complexify. Therefore, it also changed culture as a general category. The ideas that people had, the myth that had to change. Now, what I'm trying to say is this very briefly, just to summarize this point. Ever since this process started of colonizing nature and conquering nature, it has been extended to other peoples. The aim has been to subjugate, basically. And this has resulted in a tremendous linear development, which had not a lot of non-linearities, but an upward development. More and more complex societies, more and more complex technologies, powerful technologies, larger and larger population size. And this has now spread over the planet. So we have basically Western civilization with its extensive kind of evolution aimed, as you have pointed out, toward conquest, colonization, and the last 200 years increasingly at increasing consumption. This is now a worldwide phenomenon. And this phenomenon, if I just should add, this phenomenon has probably reached safe limits, with limits of safety. If we go push it any further without further thought or further qualification of the way it should go, it could move into very dangerous territories.
There is an interesting proposition that is being floated right now along the lines of what might be described as mimetic evolution, paralleling genetic evolution. So to that extent, the notion of purpose or foresight is absent even in mimetic evolution, in the sense that the idea is seeking to perpetuate itself, and that we just simply become agents of that perpetuation. Any thoughts on that?
Well, the process of evolution is sometimes said to be a blind watchmaker. So we're not talking about a designer per se, we're talking about the fact that axes can create higher forms. But you see, we have to also look at the engine that drives these things forward, either in the area of ideas, like with MEMS, or in the creation of species. There has to be a driving force pushing it. In biological evolution, it's basically survival of the fittest. That is, things have to survive. With MEMS, it's survival of the marketplace of ideas, okay? So there has to be a driving force. Now, with society, we take a look at a type 0 civilization based on nation states. Nation states are very new. There was no Germany in 1870. There was no Italy in 1870. The driving force of nation states was the development of capitalism. Because to be a capitalist with large markets, you need to have a common language, common currency, and common borders. And this, of course, is almost by definition the creation of a large nation state. So the rise of capitalism also gave us the rise of nation states, and that was the engine pushing forward the type 0 civilization. Now we're going to be entering type 1, where we have the forces of globalization, where nation states are simply too small as a mem, too small as a concept that motivates Joe Public in the streets.
Right.
Too small a concept. In the future, with the internet, we'll feel more in common with somebody in Australia and somebody in Borneo than we will with our next door neighbor and the president of our country. So in the future, countries will be mainly for fighting skirmishes with wars that are consequential, because big wars can never be fought. They're simply too dangerous to fight. Politicians will then start to wave the flag and start to get taxes. But as far as the public, as far as MEMS, as far as the idea permeating within the bulk of humanity is concerned, they will see themselves with more affinity with their bridge player in Borneo and their bridge partner in Beijing with the leader of their country. Now, nations know this. The politicians know that their power is going to ebb, and they're going to try desperately to hold on to their elite power. Right. That's a law of history. Elites will always cling tooth and nail to whatever power they have. But the forces of history will sweep them over. Kings and queens tried to hold on to their power too, and yet revolutions, wars, and so on and so forth swept over kings and queens. National capitalists will try to cling to the national boundaries of their culture, but now we have Germany and France bearing the hatchet saying, hey, we got to compete against America. Forget competing against the French and the Germans now. So I think what's happening is the forces of globalization are blind. Okay, there's no guiding force behind them, but it is an engine. It is an engine creating a type 1 economy. Now this, of course, could create excesses. It could create maldistribution of wealth. That's why I think that this transition has to be guided. We have to be conscious of the fact that this transition is taking place right before our eyes. Right. One of the greatest transitions in the history of humanity, from this time in our evolutionary history, from fragmentation and sectarianism, fundamentalism being the dominant MEMS of society, to a situation where people feel more affinity being earthlings, being more affiliated with people because of hobbies and because of interests, rather than because, well, gee, I mean, President so-and-so happens to be the governor of whatever, and so on. So we're talking more about ideas that cut across national boundaries, global,
Right.
which requires a global ethic to guide the transition so that we don't have a maldistribution of wealth.
So you are allowing for, even though you might concede that it is really a competition between memes, you are asking for or allowing for the requirement of human agency in terms of the transition that needs to be managed.
Well, you see, driving forces, I think we have to include as a main driving force what I call the myth. In other words, human ideas. They need not always be very specific and very conscious of what they're actually doing, but people individually and collectively hold a set of ideas. And because they hold a set of ideas, whether you can call them values, we can call them beliefs, we can call them ideologies, because they do this, they behave in a certain way. Now, not all societies have at all times behaved the same way. I think it's a myth that here is unchangeable, that we have always behaved the same way. We have in the modern world, in the Western world, which is now spread worldwide, this kind of civilization, this kind of value system, although not entirely everywhere, but it's just penetrating in all parts of the world. It means that this kind of behavior system is reaching a point where it's eating into the physical, biological, and I should say psychological limits of the Earth. So I agree with Professor Kaku that we are at the greatest moment of transition, perhaps in the history of humanity, certainly one of the greatest in the last 10,000 years. A similar great thing occurred from the Paleolithic to the Neolithic. My last book is called Macro Shift 2001-2010. I'm precisely saying in the next 10 years, we have to somehow make the beginning of this shift. You can call it from type 0 to toward type 1. I'm putting it in some terms. I'm saying that we are shifting basically from a value system that guides evolution along extensive levels, always more, quantitatively more, always more conquest, always more consumption, toward the kind of evolution that you can characterize as intensive, therefore which creates more and more connections, creates deeper understanding, also creates structure. This is the kind of thing that occurs in biology all the time. When you reach the limits of a resource, you start building structure. We have reached the limits of the planet. Unless we colonize other planets, and for the time being we have to make do with Earth, we have to move into another kind of evolution. And this evolution has to be guided in some way, as Professor Kaku also said, has to be guided consciously. And the key factor here, for my mind also, is ethics.
So in a sense then we could say that this blind watchmaker, with the capacities we have at our disposal, those eyes need to be open.
In some sense, because we've come of age. The Foundation for the Future, for example, often asks the question, what's going to happen in 1,000 years?
Right.
And of course, then wild speculation starts to jump out. But if you have a methodology, a framework by which to view the next 1,000 years, then it's not so strange to begin to talk about the year 3000 in terms of this framework that we're talking about. In the year 3000, we'll be laying the groundwork for a type 2 civilization. Now, between type 1 to type 2 is a factor of 10 billion. That's the difference between a planet and a star, a factor of 10 billion. Which means that for the next 1,000 years, we're going to be, first of all, stuck on the planet Earth.
Right.
We're not going to be building starships to go to colonize Alpha Centauri and the nearby stars. We're not going to be able to terraform Mars instantly and have gigantic civilizations grow on other planets. We'll have outposts, small outposts. It's not like Columbus, where a little energy expenditure, you can take a sailboat basically and go across the Atlantic Ocean. Starships are a whole other matter, okay? As a consequence, we'll have 1,000 years to build this intensive infrastructure that we're talking about. We're not going to be going to the planets, to the stars. We're going to be here on the planet Earth working out planetary problems, working out a planetary system of equitable distribution of wealth, working out a planetary discussion of the economic and the politics of power, so that everyone has a fair shake when we lay the foundations for type 2. And not only this, of course, but technology at that point will give us the ability to perhaps even change the human form. Evolution has more or less stopped in terms of the physical evolution of humans. There's no more bottlenecks like Australia. Anyone can have children, so the physical evolution of our form has more or less stopped. But in 1,000 years, that could change again. We could have guided evolution. Hopefully, it'll be by consensus. Hopefully, we will not have dictators decide to create super warriors to subjugate other humans. Hopefully, it'll be done by consensus. Everyone will have a wall screen, talk to the internet, and collectively decide whether or not we should begin to alter the nature of the human being to give us a form of perhaps even immortality, a merger of carbon and silicon, so that we replace human organs, replace organs with silicon, with genetically grown organs, extend the human lifespan, and so that by the year 3000, we'll be laying the groundwork for going into the stars.
Now, to bring it a little closer to today, one of the things that seems to kind of stand out is that the speed at which science and technology is moving out relative to essentially a space of human capacity to absorb, A, and B, the institutions that we now have, and the incapacity in that sense for them to manage the pace at which science and technology is moving out. Would you care to comment on that? That seems to have created a lot of discontinuities or great disjoints, and we see ungovernability, for example, emerging already in so many of these countries where expectations of population on the one hand and the speed at which science and technology is moving out, there's a big gap.
It's a case of the sorcerer's apprentice. We are creating all kinds of processes that become runaway processes. We can't control them anymore. We don't think about all the fallout, basically. I mean, technology assessment is a relatively recent phenomenon. But, for example, after World War II, we have created decolonization, a marvelous idea. What it has done is brought today almost 190 nation states into the world with the idea, which is now 350 years old because it was created at the end of the Peace of Westphalia, of the nation state as a sovereign autonomous entity, total fiction. So we created a fictional entity, we let them on their own, they can't cope economically, they can't adapt their cultural patterns to the market system, to the globalized system, but all of a sudden we said, you are just one of us, you know, one United States, one Malaysia, one Madagascar, etc.
And worse yet, in those populations, creating expectations that completely throw apart whatever structures that existed them in some degree of coherence and cohesion.
So all of this means that we are at a point where the total human world, the organization of the human world, is in question. It has to be reoriented in some way. Never before did we have the need for consciously guiding this evolutionary process. Up till now, we went with the idea, the more the better, basically. More is better for a small minority. Today, the poorest 20% of the world population has 1.1% of the global wealth. The next 20% has 1.9%. And 550 billionaires, according to the Fortune 500 listings, are having as much income as about 3 billion people. I mean, you can't govern a world of this. We have to move into a new phase of evolution. And here I'd just like to bring up one word or one concept that we so far have not touched on. And that's a very difficult one, I think, in terms of a physical scientist, but it is part of the world. And that's why I'm an admirer of Whitehead, among other things, because he could bring it in. And that's the word consciousness. We are a species that is conscious of itself, that look around, that is aware of its knowing, and that can therefore look also ahead. It can look back and can look ahead. We have heard not long ago a nice saying by Winston Churchill, who said, the more you look behind you, the more you can see forward into the future. We are not looking in the past. We tend to forget the past. We think the future will just make itself. But I think we have got to look ourselves as being on a trajectory from the past into the future. And that this trajectory now is inflecting. It cannot go on before, because if it goes on as before, we risk very serious breakdowns, whether it's on the level of population, whether it's a level of water, just fresh water, with a level of soil fertility, with a level of air pollution. We have possibilities of managing these things technologically, but we are not using the possibilities. And if we just continue doing what we do, we are going to have enormous break on the majority of the human population.
Well, elaborating the disparity you mentioned between science and the level of society, it goes deeper than that, in the sense that science is now beginning to change the nature of capitalism itself. When Adam Smith conceived of capitalism, he was talking about commodities, the exchange of commodities being the source of wealth, with labor power added in. And then comes Henry Ford, who adds the concept of production of these commodities. Now we're witnessing a historic shift away from commodity capitalism to intellectual capitalism. Commodity prices have been dropping, collapsing for the past 70 years. You see that. We have fruits and vegetables at our disposal that we eat for breakfast that a king of England
from anywhere in the world
could not have. A king of England would say, this is preposterous that you have foods that are cheap, that even peasants can afford a king's banquet. Well, that's because commodity prices have been dropping. Better containerization, mass production, better growing conditions, competition. However, intellectual capital cannot be containerized, cannot be mass produced. You can't simply churn out software programmers, right? And you see that wealth is being distributed in a different way because of the shift away from commodity capital to intellectual capital. You see Singapore, simply from the ashes of World War II to becoming a major powerhouse in Asia. You see China desperately grabbing for the internet. When it hates the internet, the Chinese government fears the internet to its core. But if you take out the internet out of China, you're just poor.
Right. In India too, the export of software in dollar terms exceeds all other exports put together by quite an order of magnitude.
And a Silicon Valley
all happened in the last 5 years.
Silicon Valley is growing in India. So nations that are very small and very poor, Israel, for example, is creating their own Silicon Valley and going to the top tiers of the world economy. Southeast Asia is doing this. Other countries are not. So we see two tendencies in the world today. One is a tendency toward fragmentation and revenge. With the collapse of the Cold War, nations now see other nations, rival nations, as their mortal enemy because 700 years ago they defeated them at some obscure battle on some obscure hill. That's the story of the Balkans, right?
Or is it possible that that is because what was artificially held together because of an imposition of a structure of the Soviet bloc, that the removal of it has created a situation where they're regressing to their old arrangement.
It's like a pressure cooker.
Exactly.
Okay, you had all these tensions, neo-colonial and colonial tensions left over from World War I in Italy, and held in check by the Cold War, by the two superpowers, and then you simply
remove the lid.
And it then blows up. Right. So you have two tendencies in the world. One tendency is toward unification, like with the European Union. The European Union has to compete with NAFTA, okay? They know this. They don't want to be poor. They're putting away their individual sectarian religious differences to create a society based more and more on intellectual capital. Southeast Asia knows this. For other areas of the world don't know this, okay? And they unfortunately will see most of their economies being reduced to dust. And that's why we have to get the message out, that the future is a freight train. You have to get on this train, or else it's going to bypass you and simply move on without you. And this freight train is intellectual capitalism. Capitalism itself is making a historic shift away from commodities to intellectual capital.
To completely go ahead and add the comment.
I'd just like to add a note about freight trains. There used to be, after the Second World War, the railroad theory of development, you know, that everybody goes along the same track and there's the engine that's pulling and you basically have to get on it. I'm worried about the concept that there is a kind of preferred kind of development for all of humanity. I think we're moving into an era where diversity will be essential, and there will be more than one way to develop, and more to grow. And the kind of capitalism, whether it's intellectual or commodity capitalism, I think will transform. Will work for some, will not work for others, but will need not work for everyone. Because basically what we have to do is create the space, the economic, social, and cultural space so that people can choose their own value systems and they choose their own ways that they are living. There is a turnaround, for example, in Eastern Europe. I'm quite often in Eastern Europe. I'm a native of Hungary. I get back to Eastern Europe quite often. And there was first an absolute process of being enamored of capitalism. And they engaged in a kind of cowboy capitalism where all competition and nothing but competition. Now there is another turnaround. A lot of people are becoming very disenchanted with the whole notion and are looking for other values. And I see that many parts simply do not want to buy into the global consumption kind of economy. Now, that is one thing. Let me add one more thing. You see, there is at a very basic level, you mentioned food that we can have and everybody can have, marvelous fruit that we can have. I wonder how healthy some of that fruit is actually that we're having. You know, it's becoming mass-produced, but the kind of local produce that was produced in a healthy, organic way, for example, is being very largely replaced. I live in Italy, and in Italy the local peasants are complaining, for example, that the produce that they get on the market is no longer has the quality that they would grow themselves, but they can't grow it because they are not in the market. So the large companies are basically taking over. On all levels, I feel that we are in front of a watershed. From the very basic food that we have on our table, to the breeze, to the water we are getting. On all levels, we cannot go on as we were. We have to shift some kind of a direction, and it's not just an economic recipe, I believe. I believe there is also a cultural recipe. There is also an ethics, and also cultural beliefs, a new mythology, basically, that we need.
A quick rejoinder, Professor Kaku?
Yeah, well, first I agree that nations have to choose their own way. But I think we also have to realize that if their way is not consistent with the motion of commodities, capital, and intellectual capital, nations will be reduced to poverty, okay? And even Hungary is not going to go back to communism. Okay, we're talking about variations within a theme. That Hungary, the Czech Republic, will have their own tune, but they're not going to go back to the martial music of communism because there was a very democratic and a very unresponsive system. Now, what's going to happen in the future is we're going to have more democracy. Everyone will have internet connections. The internet will be universal and basically for free as the universal Type 1 telephone system. And this means much more democratic input into the way society then produces goods and services, so that pesticides can gradually be eliminated if people desire. So I think on one hand we have fragmentation in the Balkans, we have ethnic conflicts in Africa going back to the colonial ages, and unfortunately we will see nations go backwards and have their economies be reduced to dust. Other nations, I think, will flourish in the future.
Ultimately, this has to do with future generations. We are dealing with the future, and it has to do with people in the future generations, and I appreciate the passion and the care we show. To change tracks just a little bit, and we are kind of running out of time, what three things would you transmit to children? As values, as ideas, as thoughts, as convictions, as whatever, three things would you say to the younger generations?
Well, one, I think, is a commitment to science. Science means the world as it is, not the world as necessarily we wish it to be with demons and ghosts, okay? But the way it is, so that it can be used for the good, okay? Second, I think, is caring for others to make sure that all of us enter into a new age, and so that there's compassion. And third, I would say democracy. And I think the democratic forces of the future are going to be greater than they are now with the internet, with the fact that everyone can set up web pages, distribute all sorts of manifestos on the internet. We're going to have a marketplace of ideas. So with the commitment to science, the future, to commitment to compassion, to make sure that all of us get on the train, right? Or whichever train is going in the direction of the future, right? And a commitment to democracy, that all of us will have a voice. I think that is laying the groundwork for the future.
Professor Laszlo?
I have one major point, and then perhaps some minor points to add to it. It's a little difficult to package it in terms of three. I think we have got to come to the insight that there are many ways to live, but we cannot live in a way that doesn't permit other people to live in the way they want to live. In other words, we have to have a kind of a spaceship ethics. We have 6 billion people on this earth, but 8, 9 billion according to the forecast. We have to learn to live in ways that are compatible with the freedom, with the dignity of other people. That means many other things to go along with it. That means, first of all, examining your beliefs, not simply accepting everything blindly. That means getting information from science, from the world around you, using your head, so you decide in a responsible or accountable way the way that you want to live. Not only as a private individual, but as a citizen, as a corporate manager or collaborator, and as a scientist, as a technician or whatever. See? And we have the responsibility to see that our children can choose their own lifestyles, can choose their own beliefs. That means education. Do not educate them into ours. Inform them, allow them the freedom to choose. One thing we will know about the future, it will not be the past.
Thank you very much. It's been a privilege to talk to two brilliant, fascinating minds.